Welcome to the Village Green, NBTV show on the environment in our city. I'm Nancy Gardner, your host. Today, water quality in the harbor. That's something that's always of interest. We'll be talking to Kurt Borsting, our Harbormaster, about that. We are going to talk about an oyster project in the bay. Maybe we'll have some oysters, Rockefeller soon. And then we're going to talk to a member of the Gabrieleno tribe about some projects that the city's working on in the bay as well. So lots of things about the harbor today. I am here with Kurt Borsting, our harbor master, and I know you've been working with the Harbor Commission and reworking some of the regulations for the harbor, but what struck me when you were doing the presentation, was it the council meeting?
It was a lead up to the council meeting, yes.
Was how many new water quality aspects there are to it. So I thought maybe we could talk about that a little bit. So I know, for example, for years there's been talk among some in the boating community and water quality community about dye tabs, for example. Yeah. So what's happening there?
Well, the Harbor Commission, as you mentioned, has been doing a cover-to-cover review of Title 17. And these are the municipal codes that are related to the rules of the road for the harbor here at Newport Harbor. And as part of that process, they are very interested in reinforcing the expectation that people are responsible as it relates to water quality. And so there are some new tools that are being introduced into the Title 17 rules that really just reinforce public education and give our teams some new ways to help the community keep the harbor safe. So you mentioned dye tabs, for example. I mean, introducing sewage into a public waterway like this is already against the law. I mean, there are California and federal requirements that say boaters can't do that. And this is already designated as a no discharge zone, and we are very active in trying to communicate that to visiting boaters. And the good news is that the vast majority of boaters are very, very responsible. For that reinforcement, the Title 17 requirements now give us the tool that any visiting boater into Newport Harbor will be greeted by our team and asked to board their vessel so that we can deposit a dye tab. And this will let us do a quick inspection of their sanitation systems on their boat. And in the event that they have a leak, or if they were to discharge pollutants into the harbor, it creates an iridescent. And of course, that would lead to further consequences.
Okay, so let's talk about that. I'm coming in, I'm a boater, and I'm one of those people that just says, hey, I have my rights. And you say, we'd like to place a dye tab, and I say, no.
Well, and the good news is that what we're proposing here is very standard in some boating communities. And so the practice is one that is in Avalon, and so our local boating community is going to be very familiar with it. But of course, you still have property rights as an individual, and so we would of course request permission to board your boat. We would only do so when you're present at your vessel, and if a boater were to decline our ability to say no thank you, we would rather you not do that, that's certainly within their rights and we would respect it, but then they wouldn't be assigned a mooring here in Newport Harbor and they would be asked to sail on.
Oh, okay. So in other words, if I want to be really stubborn, then I can go on and hope someplace else doesn't have dye tabs if I don't want that. All right. So but most people, as you say, are going to say, certainly. Now, if you do see some iridescence, what happens then? I mean, are they then required to leave, or do you fix it, or how does that work?
Well, of course, we're going to engage the boater to make sure that there wasn't something unexpected, that somebody made a mistake and hit the wrong side on the Y valve and had an accidental discharge. But in the event that you discharge in the harbor, that would lead to an investigative process to make sure that it again, not only meets the city's rules according to the Title 17, but that they haven't broken the law in terms of the state and federal requirements. So it could lead to fines and consequences.
All right, but they would not necessarily have to leave?
Well, I think it's going to be a situational situation to make sure we understand what took place in that moment.
Okay, so that's a little bit up in the air. All right. So another issue that has always come up of concern is liveaboards.
Yeah. Well, we're very fortunate to have a great liveaboard community here in the harbor. And these are people that this is actually their place of residence, and they perform a very valuable service to the community of boaters, is that in that it's a neighborhood watch style program as well, so that people that reside aboard their boat are often the first people that can see something that's wrong afoot, so if a vessel appears to be taking on water or suspicious activity in the harbor. And so the role of the liveaboard community is one that's really valued. They're also one of the heaviest users of the harbor, and so because of that, making sure that their systems are properly cared for and managed is all that more important. In the current version of Title 17, the liveaboard community provides a annual reporting of their pump out activity, so that it demonstrates that they have been responsible in terms of use of the public areas where sewage can be responsibly disposed of. But it's the honor system today. And so under the new version of Title 17, it will move to a more accountable system where either the liveaboard community will use a commercial service to pump out at their vessel, and then those records would be available for the city to review, or in the event that they would prefer not to use that system, they would then meet with my office and we would come up with some equivalent but still accountable system, so that it's not just on the honor system, but it would be verifiable that those pump outs took place and that everybody's being responsible.
Okay, well, that's obviously if someone is on liveaboard and reports that they haven't been to a pump out station for a year, then you'd have a concern.
Well, and in that situation, there is a plausible explanation. If I'm a very active boater and I regularly go to Catalina and I go beyond the 3-mile distance where legally pumping out one's head is allowed, then that can explain some of that. But we want to be able to engage in that dialogue, make sure that the harbor is safe from illegal pollutants. And the very good news is that the community supports this. As the Title 17 review took place, there were 6 public meetings that the commission hosted, very well attended. And the water quality themes that we're talking about today I would describe it as universally supported by the people that were there. And we got some good feedback about, for example, what I just shared with you about use of the public pump out area versus a commercial service. And we got some very good feedback from community members that helped shape the ultimate direction that the commission took with that rule recommendation.
Well, I also noticed that we do have public pump out stations, but there's more information on them now to make them more user friendly.
Well, there are 5 located throughout the harbor that the city owns and operates, and we're in the rollout process right now of trying to develop. Well, we have developed basically large infographics that are on the body of that cabinet that is the piece of equipment, so that it's very clear what the how to use the equipment properly, how to call our office, what the right number is if you encounter a piece of equipment that is not working, and then we're also trying to encourage the public to download a app that is available not only for Newport Harbor, but as they travel the California waterways, where you can just go on your smartphone and immediately find locations where public pump outs are available to you. And in the event you encounter one that isn't working, you can report it on your app as not working. And what that helps all of us do that manage these systems is to respond quicker and get them back up and running again.
All right, and then there's I'm not a boater, so this is always, it took me a long time to realize there was a difference, but sort of like the sewer lines and the storm drain sort of thing. So the bilge water.
Yeah. So boats can accumulate water in their bilge, and sometimes what boaters will do is they will use those public pump outs that are intended for the sewage material as a quick way to remove that water from their vessel. That is not allowed. We promote that at the locations, and the primary, just very practical reason for that is that those bilges can sometimes include things like nuts and bolts and little pieces of metal that when they get introduced into the equipment, it results in the equipment being torn, and the parts that then are moving the sewage material out into the proper sewage lines then don't work, and that puts that piece of equipment out of order for the boating community. It's also just as it would always be, that's the most expensive part on that piece of equipment. And so somebody that is using it inappropriately for the bilge water removal, it can cost thousands of dollars to the community at large every time that happens. And so we've been really promoting that. But what's really great is that the city's taken an even more proactive approach in that in the current capital budget is a project that when completed will actually give a location in the harbor where boaters can responsibly extract that water from
So
their
there'll be a bilge pump out.
There'll be a bilge pump out, exactly.
Well, that will be very good. Well, anything else in the new regs that you think will help with water quality?
Well, I mean, one of the other things, aside from the Title 17 that we're excited about, is that the city was recently awarded a $175,000 grant through the State of California Division of Boating and Waterways to help remove derelict vessels from the harbor. And a boat that falls into disrepair and ultimately can be one that can leak pollutants into the harbor or in the worst case situation sink. And so having those financial resources to expediently remove distressed vessels from the harbor so they can be disposed of properly is going to be a very valuable tool for water quality. And that grant also allows a provision where if you're a private owner of a vessel and you feel like your boat's getting close, you can voluntarily turn it in under certain provisions. It has to be a recreational vessel. It has to have a clean title. And then if you meet all those qualifications through the application process, the city actually can take over title and then assist you with the proper disposal. And it's just basically turning over the pink slip of a vessel that needs to leave the harbor.
So you would say that you wouldn't have to scuttle your own boat for whatever reason.
That's the type of thing that the state is trying to, of course, work against during trying to streamline that process.
So how do you identify a derelict boat? I mean, some of them look a little ratty, but that may be just a coat of paint.
Well, the boats I'm referring to in this case are boats that were abandoned in the harbor that the city has had to take on through an impound process. And then after making those boats available through a public auction, if they don't sell, it ultimately becomes the city's responsibility to responsibly dispose of them. And these state resources are going to help us fund those removals.
Oh, great. Well, it sounds like a lot of improvements in the harbor, which is already, of course, such a great harbor. And thanks to you and your crew for working on all these things.
Well, thank you for coming out today and learning and helping us share the word.
All right. I'm here with Katie Nichols of Coastkeeper, and you've got a really interesting program here, and I want you to tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, so I'm the Marine Restoration Director with Orange County Coastkeeper. It's a local nonprofit focused on clean water. So we advocate for waters that are fishable, drinkable, and sustainable. And our restoration program in Upper Newport Bay is looking at how we can restore the native oyster, the Olympia oyster, which is almost functionally extinct in Southern California, and native eelgrass, and how we can maximize the benefits of those two species and look at how they co-occur and how that influences the habitat.
So, obviously, first question, can you eat them?
I personally wouldn't eat the oysters out of Newport Bay. They're filter feeders, so they can concentrate a lot of toxins. But one of the goals for Coastkeeper is to eventually have that be a sustainable seafood source. That should be our water quality standard, is having shellfish we can consume in our waterways. But right now, personally, I don't think that's the case.
But they are a kind that you could eat.
The native Olympia oyster has been historically harvested back in the 1800s. It's almost functionally extinct here in Southern California. They're pretty small, but they are edible. You can find some up in Washington and Oregon, and you still can eat some in restaurants.
Okay, so the oysters are filter feeders. So in other words, they're actually helping clean the water, aren't they, in a way?
Correct. Oysters and eelgrass are both really important for water quality and clarity. Oysters filter gallons of seawater in a day, so they can provide a lot of benefits to the water other than providing a really important habitat. Eelgrass does as well because they're a photosynthetic plant, so they provide oxygen in addition to kind of stabilizing sediments, which is really important for our bay.
So now, how do you go about? Are you hanging them on something? Are they in bags, or how does this program work?
So our program in Upper Newport Bay used clean Pacific oyster shell. That's the species Crassostrea gigas. That's more typical of what you would see in restaurants. So it's a different species, and we've used that shell to provide the habitat for the native Olympia oyster to settle. So we're looking at some of our clean Pacific oyster shell. This is more typical like what you would see in a restaurant. And this is the clean shell that we laid down as habitat for the native Olympia oyster to settle. So you can see how complex this is. There's lots of nooks and crannies. That's how we can get an oyster bed over time, is by settling on the shells of other oysters.
I see. Okay, and you clean these or anything, or they just come as they are?
They take about 6 months to a year to cure, they say, to get all that other tissue material off from the other species. So we're trying to do some small-scale pilot projects, recycling these directly from restaurants, but we actually got these from an aqua farm down in Carlsbad.
Oh, okay.
And a lot of oyster restoration projects on the East Coast will put that shell out in like plastic mesh bags or some other kind of hard structure. Our project is a little bit different because we used all biodegradable coconut coir mesh. So this is that biodegradable material I was talking about, coconut coir. So it's made from the husks of coconut. So instead of using a plastic mesh or some kind of cement baycrete or something like that, we're using this mesh material to keep the shell consolidated long enough that the Olympia oysters can then settle on it.
How long does it last, you think?
It lasts quite a while underwater. Actually, it took over a year to break down. But once this all biodegrades, then hopefully that shell remains. The new oysters are starting to build sort of a sustaining bed.
So, all right, you've got the shells out there. How did the oysters then get there?
So oysters settle on any kind of hard substrate, so they can settle on rocks or pier pilings, but they really like to settle on the shells of other oyster. So once we put that settlement out, a habitat out, it provides the habitat for them to increase their populations.
So we know you knew that there was a population of those oysters already.
Correct. It's a collaborative project with Cal State Long Beach and Cal State Fullerton. And Dr. Danielle Zackerl at Cal State Fullerton is an Olympia oyster biologist. And we've tracked the larval supply and quantities over time. And the great thing, even though there's a really small population left of Olympia oysters, there's still enough in the larval column and enough in the surrounding waters that if we build the right habitat in the right places, we'll be able to increase their populations.
So it's not like there's not a source of larvae that we can bring in and say, okay, now we're going to, plop these around the shells and let them do it. These are all just in whatever in the water.
Our project doesn't use any spat or any oyster seed. It's all natural.
And are any results so far?
Yeah, we've seen oyster densities up to 3 to 6 times what they would be naturally, which is not very much here in the bay. But between our 4 sites, we've seen almost 10 to 20,000 new oysters coming into these beds.
So then you could, once they're established, you can just say walk away and they'll keep going, or how does that work?
No, the goal is really to monitor this project long term because we're looking at oysters and eelgrass together and separately and how that influences the overall community. So we're looking at the fish, the invertebrates, things living on the oysters, and that's going to change by season, by weather, over time. So our goal is to really monitor long term to see how this changes and to see what our success rate is and how long we need to keep maybe adapting our design or changing things, adding some more shell if that's something that we need to do.
All right. I've read that one of the concerns with our shellfish along the coast is ocean acidification. Now, does this factor into your project at all?
It definitely does. Rising sea levels and increasing CO2 and ocean acidification are all going to be big challenges for the coast. Fortunately, a lot of projects, one that I'm involved with, another collaborative project is looking at seagrass and its ability to buffer atmospheric carbon. So because it's a photosynthetic plant, it can be really important in hopefully combating ocean acidification. But both oysters and eelgrass are going to be vulnerable to that threat.
I know that they've been looking at certain species and saying this species tends to do better than another one. Do we have any feeling as far as the oysters here, whether they are more susceptible or less susceptible to the effects of acidification?
I mean, all oyster populations would be vulnerable. The Olympia, because its populations are super low in Southern California, is going to be, I would say, almost extra susceptible to those kinds of threats. But that's why it's really important to restore those populations and try to create resilient habitats that can face some of those growing threats.
Do they do anything in terms of, I don't think erosion, obviously, but in terms of sort of stabilizing areas, could they be part of a way to deal with sea level rise, for example?
Exactly. So our project is called a living shoreline. So most of our habitats and bays in Southern California are super modified, and we prevent erosion by putting in break walls and hard structures. But oyster reefs and eelgrass can be really important as providing those kind of structures that stabilize sediments and prevent coastal erosion. So that's one of the goals of this project, is to really test that, tease that factor out, and see how important they might be, and if we can scale this up and really protect our shoreline that way.
Is there a timeline on this project? I mean, you're saying we'd like to see something by 5 years or 10 years, or because some of these things can run on forever.
Yeah, so our initial project, we're about 3 years post restoration. We planted the oyster beds in 2017, but our goal is to do some long-term monitoring, so see what it looks like in 5 to 10 years. That would be the amazing goal, is to keep the project going for as long as we can.
And then others obviously can learn from what you've done, and we can start them elsewhere in the harbor, but other estuaries and other areas along the Pacific coast?
Yeah, there are some small-scale oyster restoration efforts along the coast and living shorelines efforts up in San Francisco Bay. So there's some really good collaboration among the scientists trying to figure out the best methods to do it, and our project will definitely be important in informing that.
Well, I think that's very interesting. I look forward to maybe eating one of these days. Listening to your long-term results, because obviously these sort of things are so important, not just to the health of the bay, but to the health of the entire ecosystem around here.
They are, and I really hope that we can get people engaged in some of these habitats. Eelgrass and oysters aren't as charismatic as our whales and fish species, but they're also really important. So conserving this estuary is something that's a long-term goal for Coastkeeper and myself.
Well, when you say get people more involved, you mean just their interest, or is there something you'd like them to do?
Well, donations always help because we're a small nonprofit, but getting out and volunteering, we have some opportunities coming up in the spring and the summer. We love volunteers to come out to our monthly beach cleanups as well. There's a lot of different ways you can get engaged with the environment here, just even through recreation as well, and learning more about it and participating any way you want to.
Okay, so if they want to get more information on that, they would go to?
Coastkeeper.org.
Coastkeeper.org. All right. The Olympic Oyster Project by Coastkeeper. We're all looking forward to the results. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm here with Andy Salas, and you are, what is your title?
I'm the tribal chair of the Gabrieleno Band of Mission Indian Kizh Nation.
All right. I was fortunate enough, when I was in school, we actually had a section on the local tribes.
Right.
I don't know if they still do that in elementary school.
Well, they're starting to talk about the history of the tribes, which is a good thing. But when I was young and I was going to school back in the 70s, didn't talk much about our ancestral.
I went a few years before you did.
Yeah.
I was fortunate enough, though, that my father was, he loved the West.
Right.
And so he brought me home all sorts of books, and not so much the California Indians. I was a Crazy Horse and,
Right.
the Sioux, and because I was a
Right.
horse person, so I loved
Right.
the fact that
The
they
Plains
wrote
Indians.
the Plains Indians.
Right.
But I know there was he did talk a lot about, because he was a skin diver, and about abalone and all these things, and as part of the diet and everything of the people who lived here.
Right.
So tell us a bit more about your tribe's background.
Well, this area here was part of a large community here. Up here in the bluffs, our ancestors lived in these areas. This was the village of Kenyangna, meaning the bay, the Back Bay. This area provided, since the salt water and the sweet water or fresh water would meet here, we'd have steelhead, trout, and then we'd also have shark, clam, shellfish in these areas. This was a good hunting, gathering area. We didn't have to break our heads going down and fishing in the ocean. Everything was provided here in this particular area.
So it's usually a sad story as far as what happens when the Native American meets the newcomers.
Right.
How long before your particular band was just sort of dismantled and made to move?
Well, me, myself, my family, my father, we're actually descendants of a prominent family in the San Gabriel area. However, our ancestors were from these areas and brought into the mission. But the prominent family I descend from or originate from was a prominent Indian or indigenous native of our tribe. He was given the name Nicholas Joseph. In 1785, he led a few revolts in San Gabriel. There's stories behind him and stories behind an individual, a young lady that he instigated to help him with this uprising, and her name is Torperina. But to answer your question, it was kind of when the first Spanish arrived here in about the early 1700s, 1760s, as we became mestizos. I come directly also a lineal descendant of the Perez Nietos family, of Rancho Los Nietos. They were the Spanish managers of San Juan Capistrano and the San Gabriel Mission, who established a ranch in Whittier Narrows area, or the Whittier area, or they call it today Los Nietos, Rancho Los Nietos. Those were my grandfathers. They became my grandfathers because their sons married the daughters and granddaughters of Nicholas Joseph.
If someone wanted to know more about the background and the history of this particular band, is there a website or something they can go to?
There's a website. You could go to www.gabrielenoindians.com or .org.
Okay. I want to ask a question because it's today we are all very politically correct. We try to be very sensitive, and I grew up using the term Indian because that's what I had heard of. Is there a preference of how we should refer to the bands?
Well, we like to be called, and the way we were brought up is indigenous people, where we utilize that name. But I know that in the schools they do refer, or the people better acknowledge us as Indians today. But we are the indigenous people of these lands. A lot of us we still reside there in San Gabriel, but we like to be indigenous or be called indigenous people.
Okay, good. I feel better about that now knowing. So, you've grown up around here. You know a lot about the natural environment. Right. You were saying that there were some plants that are found here that probably most of us aren't aware of.
Right. Well, and that's what I was talking to you earlier about. Like I mentioned, my grandfather, Ernie, who worked the sugar beet ranches up in Los Alamitos, that's where a lot of my family later resided because of the work and the sugar beets. But in this particular area, in the early 1900s, there was sugar beet ranches not too far from here in the Irvine area. And those were established by the Irvine family, James Irvine and McFadden, and those individuals that later became the early prominent settlers of this area. My grandfather would deliver there to those ranches. And on his way there, and that's funny that, we meet here, because even when I was a kid back in the late 70s, my father would bring us here to this area to actually pick a particular plant here that was used for inflammation, used for sickness, and the coming of young ladies of puberty would be the yerba mansa that would grow near the natural springs that are out here. A lot of people don't know about them, but these natural springs, not only were they medicinal and utilized for healing of the body, but the plants around them that were able to establish themselves near these watersheds or these springs were utilized medicinal plants. We came here to pick them in this particular area location. And as we walked here a year ago, we talked about those plants.
That's funny because I go back, my ancestors don't go back quite as long as yours in this area, but I grew up here, and I can remember my father and I would go in the Back Bay, and we'd get cockles. And in those days, you could take things out and eat them. I mean, actually,
Right.
steamed cockles were so wonderful.
Right. And see, in this particular area, it's an estuary. So just like Ensenada, in those areas, you ever been to Ensenada, they have these famous fish tacos. Well, the fish tacos made there are made of shark. That's what you would get here. That fish or that taco that would be made for these small sharks that would enter the bay here. They'd gather them and they'd chop them up, and it fillet of good fish here in this particular
We
area.
will have to have a recipe to go along
Right,
with this show.
right.
All right, well, we're going to talk a bit about the environment. Why don't you come on in? As you said, you had walked this area. What's going on here as far as the environment?
So what's great is a lot of what we used to have is still preserved, but we also have impacts from just all the development that has occurred around the area. So what has occurred is there's some no longer indigenous plants. We have non-native plants that have started to come in. Because of all the development, we also have some erosion and changes within the creeks and streams and some of the springs that used to be here. So some of that has changed, and that's what Andy and I were walking here to not only understand what's here from the cultural standpoint, but understand the plants that were here and were important for this environment, and then trying to restore some of that, particularly restoring the natural hydrology, the streams, the springs. So those native plants and that culture that was associated with that are brought back in this area.
Well, that will be very interesting if it can be done. Now, will there be any information that your band will provide? I mean, are there going to be like any kiosks or things to talk about
We
some
like
of the
to work
background?
together to provide that, to put some of the natural names of the old plants, the history here of this location. A lot of people walk these trails and don't understand really where they're at, and we want to be able, in this day and this time, to give that acknowledgement once and for all.
Absolutely. That was one of the key things as part of this, is not only restoring and removing some of those non-native plants, getting the native plants back, but also providing information, education through Andy and his relatives and his band to really understand and the value of that and what the importance of that from medicinal significance as well as cultural. So bringing that information back to the local here, it's fascinating. It's really very interesting, and I think that I got turned on and really got interested in it from Andy just walking around here and just showing us, and I'm sure others would really enjoy it and really get interested as well, as long as that information is brought out.
I'm sure, because I think that unlike some other areas, there hasn't been much recognition locally.
That's correct. Not much recognition, and we're working hard. Our generation is to get out there and give that recognition, that understanding. That's all we're looking for, is the recognition of these beautiful areas that still exist here and that need to be saved and acknowledged.
Well, I think we can learn something from your history for sure. A little more detail on the project.
So I'm in the Public Works Department, and we don't have a project here yet. It's a Newport Bay Conservancy that is the lead.
Okay.
And so we are supporting their efforts for restoration. Of course, we have a water quality issue here in the Santa Isabella Channel, and there's also some issues about the flood control, the condition of the flood control channel. So we're going to be working with Newport Bay Conservancy, Andy Salas, and the County of Orange for a restoration project here that will probably also mitigate some things like selenium and bacteria, etc.
Good. Anything in terms of sea level rise?
So that's an excellent point. One of our funding partners, the Ocean Protection Council, is very concerned about the marine protected area here in Newport Bay. And so there's an opportunity to create some areas where climate change can be accommodated and allow the biology and the flora and the fauna to actually migrate into the channel. So it's all part of the future project. And of course, Andy's been kind of telling us some of the history here and finding the hidden springs here and things like that. So we're very interested in this project.
Well, we tend to be, a little bit egocentric, and that the world started when, say, the Irvine Company, Irvine came, and we don't know enough about this. So I'm looking forward to more information and having this history. With a restoration project as well. That's when we use our cliche, our win-win, but that will be so valuable.
Well, you came to the right people.
We did, and I'm so happy to do it, and I look forward to it. And anything else you want to tell us about the project or this area that we might not know?
Well, I'm just very grateful for Bob, David, and the relationship that we built to preserve such a beautiful area just like this. It needs to be preserved. Just look at it. Look how beautiful.
Well, I'm pleased with the preservation, but I'm also pleased that we're finally going to get some history.
Some
history
history.
that certainly I don't
That's
know
important.
and that the rest of us need to know more
Right.
about.
And that's very important. Like I didn't mention earlier, my father wasn't here. I wanted to bring him here with us today so I could introduce it. But my father actually lived with General George Patton. My father and my aunts and my uncles, they were the servants to Benjamin D. Wilson of Mount Wilson and Ramona Yorba of Yorba Linda, who Antonio Yorba, Ramona's great-grandfather, was the owner, Spanish, Mexican, Spanish land grants, acquired all this land later. So there's a lot of rich history. We're the original families of the areas that extended all the way to the Aliso Creek in this area and inhabited this area. And some of our relatives still reside in these areas they're I don't want to say they're forgotten, but they're still there. And they have a piece of that history they would like to share also pertaining to this beautiful area.
Andy, one thing that you had talked about before that I thought was very fascinating was the importance of this area, and that there was, because of the resources here, there were very important villages in this area, and that you had explained that story about the abalone, that they found abalone all the way in Arizona
Yes.
because of the transfer of goods
The transfer,
and how that was done.
exactly.
So if you could share that.
And that's why a lot of these area locations within the sister tribes, we respect our traditional ancestral territories because of the resources that were utilized in trade.
Uh-huh.
There was resources here that our sister tribes could not get in the south area or the southern area or the eastern area. And everything that we were able to provide for them came from a lot of these areas. There's a clan up towards I would say up in the El Paso area. In that area, there's a tribe up there. They call themselves the Abalone clan.
Really?
There's no ocean over there
No.
in that area, near where they're at. Their resource, that abalone, came from this area, this coastal area.
They dry it or something?
They would there was salt fields here.
Uh-huh.
They would get them, that salt, preserve them,
Cure them, uh-huh.
cure them, and send them off up the trade routes back into the Mojaves and those
I
areas.
had no idea.
And it's all here. You got the old you have Davies Locker. That's right here. It's established there because Davies Locker, just like the Catalina Express, they're established in those locations because they use the original trade route into the ocean, into the Channel Islands, which is that original current that takes them there and brings them back. Our people didn't break their backs and row and row and row. They just coasted to those islands, brought back what they needed, and out into those areas, abalone and what have you, black abalone that came from San Nicolas Island and shipped out into those areas. Very unique. And that's why we have a respect for our ancestral tribal areas, because the resources that many other native sister tribes were not able to get, they depended on us. That's why we were the richest, not with money, but with resource in this area.
Well, I look forward to whatever signage we come up with because I think it'll be very informative, and I think we need more of it, and I think maybe the Moose Center should have a display on some of this, but this was very interesting, and I thank you so much for sharing your story.
Thank you. And I want to thank these two beautiful gentlemen for the relationship that we built with them in the city of Newport.
Thank you. Well, that's our show, and until next time, let's all work on making our village green.